The book of Ruth is a complex story. It is more than a love story. It's a story about immigration, about relationships, about the agency of women in a patriarchal society. It's about God's presence beyond and behind the scenes, leading us and guiding us to new horizons. It is a romance between Ruth and Boaz, but it's also a story of survival and economics. After all, two women without resources are almost sure to perish without some help from the outside. A relative of mine once told her daughter, "If you get married, be sure to marry a wealthy man." And Boaz is that wealthy man. He's a landowner. He has prosperous fields. He's well respected in the community. And Naomi sets her eyes on him as Ruth's husband. As a matter of fact, there seems to be some energy between Ruth and Boaz. And so Naomi has a scheme. It's harvest time, and when the harvest is gathered, there'll be parties going on. And it's likely that Boaz is going to celebrate and then retire to his tent. Naomi suggests that Ruth move into the tent, slip in there, and then let nature take its course. All of a sudden, we reach parental guidance. There's not too much information here, but one can read between the lines. Boaz is entranced, and he wants to marry Ruth, and he does what he needs to do within the community to secure her as his wife. And shortly thereafter, they become pregnant with their first child, Obed, who is the grandfather of King David. Obed is the grandfather of King David, and Ruth, this Moabite woman, is his great-grandmother. Imagine that, a foreigner in a world in which people prized racial purity. As I said last week, Ruth was written to challenge xenophobia and a ban on mixed-race marriages. Well, what does Ruth have to do with us today? Ruth doesn't give us political policy. It doesn't tell us who to vote for, but it tells us that immigrants can be the source of God's revelation. It tells us that immigrants and refugees are God's beloved children, and that we better treat them with hospitality. As the book of Hebrews notes, sometimes we entertain angels unaware. So be generous and kind to strangers. Ruth also tells us that women can be agents of their destiny. Ruth and Naomi survive because they're creative, because they have plans, because they try to solve problems. They're not passive victims, they're creative actors. Surely that ought to be the case in our world today. Ruth tells us that we can be God's partners, that God doesn't want us, male or female, to stand at the sidelines, but to be God's partners in shaping the world to come. And finally, and perhaps this is where there's an intersection between Ruth and process theology, Ruth talks about God's gentle providence. God doesn't announce God's self with fanfare, but is present in the lives of women and men, guiding them, encouraging them, inspiring them, and enabling them to use their freedom, yes, their freedom, to do new and creative things. Ruth is a parallel to another immigration story, the flight of the Holy Family. You may recall that Joseph has a dream, and he takes his family, Mary, and the young baby Jesus to Egypt. God is present with immigrants and refugees everywhere. Again, this doesn't give us political policy guidelines, but it says that our attitude toward the stranger should be one of hospitality, love, and care. For when we entertain a stranger, we may be entertaining God's children. And of course, as you know, without Ruth, there wouldn't have been David. Without Ruth, there might not have been Jesus. So let us look at this story as one of love, the love of two women for each other, the love of Ruth and Boaz, God's love for us, and our call to love the stranger.